We're in Matthew chapter 5. This is part 3 of the baptism of John. What was it for? And really thought we covered a lot of territory and a lot of ground this morning on a man that is an enigma, misunderstood. He's puzzling to a lot of folks. They don't realize his real purpose and so forth, and just what he was doing, and why in the world he was called the Baptist. And we will look at next Sunday his name and title. But that title is indicative of what his function was with regard to Israel. And he was sent exclusively to Israel. His baptism was for them. It was only after it was upgraded with the Great Commission and the arrival of Christ that his baptism was included in the message for the world at that time. But we're going to focus tonight, first of all, on something that Jesus said when he was baptized. First, we're going to look at verse number 17 in Matthew 5. Jesus was born under the dispensation of law, and he fulfilled the law. As a matter of fact, the times when the age of the Lord was revealed, at 8 days old, according to the law, he was what? Circumcised. When he was 12 years old, according to the law, he became a child of the covenant, you see. And so he was in Jerusalem for the Passover at 12 years of age. He was keeping the feasts that are incorporated in the law. Here he is at 30 years of age, and what is he doing? He is being baptized in fulfillment of the law. Now that's very important, because here in verse number 17 he says, "Think not that I'm come to destroy the law." I'm not here to say that the law is no good. I'm here to, in actuality, do away with some aspects of the law by bringing in a new covenant. But still, there are a lot of things about the law that are going to be incorporated into the kingdom, mainly the conditionality of it all. And the prophets, I'm not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Now we go to Matthew chapter 3. And verse number 13. Then comes Jesus from Galilee to Jordan unto John to be baptized of him. Now, here's a good question to ask our Baptist friends. Why don't you baptize in the river? Why don't you go to a running stream? Because as we're going to see in just a little bit, all true baptism, unless it was in the laver or some other smaller aspects of purifying, had to be done where there was running water. And of course, the Jordan qualified for that. And so Jesus went where? To the local Baptist church to be dunked in a tank of water in the back. He did not. He went to the wilderness of Judea where John was baptizing in the Jordan River, at the exact place where the children of Israel forded the river into the land, the second Exodus generation. But John forbade him, saying, I have need to be baptized of you, and you come to me. I mean, what's going on here? You're the Messiah. I'm just the forerunner. But note what Jesus said. And this gives tremendous validity to John's baptism and his authorization from God himself. Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becomes us to fulfill all righteousness. John's baptism was a righteous act. John's baptism was a baptism which saved and which washed away sins. But now, when you come to these aspects of washing away sins, you have to ask yourself a question regarding Israel. Because Israel had two categories of sins: inward sins of the heart and outward sins of cleanliness. And we simply today in America, in the dispensation of grace, cannot seem to relate to what was going on in Israel under law at the time, and especially in the baptism of John. So I thought we would go through some of the things that required baptism. Let's go back then to Leviticus chapter 11. Now, I don't know of any other way to do this rather than jumping around, but simply we will skip over some verses, but simply to read through these chapters, Leviticus chapter 11, and note some verses and make some comments as we go. Because this is what John's baptism was about. Yes, it involved the forgiveness of inward sins, but it also washed away sins. Now, isn't that something? We just sang a song. Are you washed in the what? Blood of the Lamb. But you know what you had to ask them with regard to their salvation? Have you been washed in the Jordan River? Are your garments spotless? Well, okay, but now which garment? I don't have blood on my garments. What's it talking about? The inward cleansing of the blood. But you know what? They had to wash blood out of their garments if they wanted to serve the Lord. And they had to wash it in water. But let's look first here at the law of the clean and unclean animals. Moses was speaking to the children of Israel. Verse 2, these are the beasts which ye shall eat among all the beasts of the earth. And then it goes on down here, giving the various beasts that they are allowed to eat and some that they are not allowed to eat. Now, those that were not to be eaten, if you note the last part of verse number 4, these beasts were unclean to you. For example, the coney, because he chews the cud but doesn't divide the hoof, he's unclean to you. Then it goes on down to talk about the hare or the rabbit. He's unclean to you. The swine, he is unclean to you. But note verse number 8. This is very important. Of their flesh shall ye not eat, and their carcass shall ye not touch. Now, you have to understand that Israel was full of these animals. We even remember the time when Jesus Christ had the legion of demons, and he was approaching people who were doing what? Keeping 2,000 head of hog on the hillside of Galilee. Well, what were these Jews keeping 2,000 swine there for? It was against the law. They were touching swine, and they were unclean. And so John's baptism was calling them, these people, if they wanted to be saved, they had to come to his baptism. But what else did they have to do? Get rid of the pigs. Now you tell me that is a salvation requirement today, to get rid of unclean animals and to be baptized with your flesh and your clothes in the water in order for you to be saved. How were you saved? You believed in Jesus Christ. Whatever your outward condition was, you believed in Christ and you were washed in the blood of the Lamb. And your outward condition may have been clean or unclean. What does it matter? You were still saved, but not under law. Under law, if they kept swine, they were unclean. And not only were they not to keep the swine, they weren't to touch the swine nor eat it. Then it goes on down with the waters. And it talks about those that you can eat and not eat, but it talks in the last part of verse 10 about these unclean ones being an abomination. Now, an abomination simply meant it's an abhorrence. Oh no, we can't eat it. Yes, we can look on it, but we're not supposed to touch those things. Why? Because they make us unclean. It says here in verse number 11, they shall be even an abomination to you. You'll not eat of their flesh, but ye shall have their carcasses in abomination. In other words, don't touch it. It will make you unclean. Now, we're not at the verses yet, but we'll get to them eventually. That if you were unclean and approached the Lord in tabernacle or temple service, you died. Now, this is why it was important for them to wash. Now, don't you just know that Jesus Christ had to watch some of these things? He had to be on the alert and on guard all the time, with clean and unclean. But now, if he did touch them, with certain ones of them, he could get clean by the baptism, just as everyone else could. These are they which ye shall have in abomination of the fowls. And then it goes on down to say what they are. And an abomination meant you were not to eat them and you were not to touch them. Okay, verse number 24. And for these ye shall be unclean. Whosoever touches the carcass of them shall be unclean until even. Whosoever beareth the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until even. Verse number 26, last part of the verse. Everyone that touches them shall be unclean. Whosoever touches their carcass shall be unclean till evening. He that bears the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean to the evening, says verse number 28. On and on it goes, verse 31. These are unclean to you that creep. Whosoever does touch them when they're dead shall be unclean until evening. And it tells with regard to this. Okay, but now let's note, starting with verse number 32. And upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, doth fall, it shall be unclean. Whether it's a vessel of wood, or raiment, or skin, or sack, whatsoever vessel it be, whereon any work is done, it must be put into water. Now, this is baptism. The only thing is, it's a baptism of a utensil, a vessel, a sack, a dish, a cup, if you will. But note now verse number 33. Every earthen vessel whereunto any of them falleth, whatsoever is in it shall be unclean, and you'll break it. Why? Because the earthen vessel was porous. And if the unclean animal touched it and it happened to rub off, you might not get all of the uncleanness, whatever it is, a slimy fish or whatever. It might not get all of the uncleanness if you try to scour it out. And it might be drawn in so that when you drink it, you're drinking uncleanness. And then you come into the temple and all of a sudden you're struck dead and you say, what in the world hit me? It's a bolt of lightning out of the blue. Why were they killed? Because it absorbed into the porous vessel and they drank it and became unclean, and it was unknown to them. So if they had an unclean vessel, they broke it. Of all the meat which might be eaten, that on which such water cometh shall be unclean, and drinking the very same thing. Now, note the same in verse number 35 for the pots and the ranges and the oven. They shall be broken down, for they are unclean to you. Nevertheless, a fountain or a pit wherein there's plenty of water shall be clean, but that which touches their carcass shall be unclean. If you have running water, in other words, the fountain there, it's clean. But if part of their carcass falls upon any sowing seed which is sown, it shall be clean. Now, take note. If the seed is dry and the carcass fall upon it, and it's there for a while, the seed is still good. You can use it. But if any water be on the seed, any part of their carcass fall thereon, it shall be unclean. Why? Because when you put water on seed, what happens? It begins to sprout. And some of that is absorbed into the seed. They had to throw it away because that would have made them, they would have absorbed this uncleanness, and it was not allowed. So on and on. He that touches the carcass thereof shall be unclean. Verse 40, he that eats the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean to evening. He that bears the carcass of it shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. On and on it goes, so that you come down to verse number 43. Neither shall ye make yourselves, last part of the verse, unclean with them, that ye should be defiled thereby. You see, we don't have to worry about these things in the time in which we live. We can touch all of these unclean animals. We can feed a pig. We can pat it on the head. We can touch it. We can come immediately into church and we will not be smitten or struck down. But they could not do it. Okay, let's go on. The reason, for I am the Lord your God, therefore sanctify yourselves. Now, this is going to be important because sanctification meant washing their utensils, their ovens, their dishes, and so forth. It meant washing all of these things, but especially their clothes and their flesh. Why? Because that's what they were going to bring into the tabernacle with them. Their clothes and their flesh. I mean, you can't leave those behind. You approach God in your clothes and your flesh. And so it had to be absolutely cleansed. I brought you out of Egypt. I'm holy. You got to be holy. That means to stay away from defilement. What kind of defilement? Unclean beasts. Can't touch them. This is the law of the beast, the foul, living creature that moves in the waters, and so forth, to make a difference, verse 47, between the unclean and the clean, the beast that might be eaten, and the beast that may not be eaten. Okay, let's come from this point to chapter 15. Now, if I say something tonight in my commentary here that may appear to be gross, please note I am not doing that purposefully. There's not going to be any shock value here, though it may shock you. I'm not trying to shock you. I'm just trying to tell you that if you take yourself here and you transport yourself back in time and you live in the times of Christ with John the Baptist and his baptism, this is what he was doing. Obviously, the people in the surrounding areas had touched unclean beasts. What did they have to do? They had to come for baptism or a cleansing. So he dunked their flesh and their clothes right in the Jordan River. The water washed it away. It had to be running water. It could not be a stagnant pool because the water was to wash the filth away. You know, when you take a bath, the ring, it means you're there with the same crud that was on your body. It's just collected around the ring. Now, that's why it's good to take a shower. What happens? It washes it away as you go. So, verse number 1, speak again to the children of Israel. When any man hath a running issue out of his flesh. Now again, you understand, this is infection. He's got a boil, and it festers. And there is, please excuse the phrase, pus coming out of it. Infection coming out of an open wound. Because of his issue, he is unclean. And this shall be his uncleanness in his issue. Whether his flesh run with his issue or his flesh be stopped from his issue, it's unclean. Whether you've got a scab over it, if it's still festering, you're still unclean. Or if it's an open wound and the defilement is pouring out on the flesh, you're still unclean. Every bed, note this, whereon he lieth that has an issue is unclean. Everything whereon he sitteth shall be unclean. Whosoever touches his bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean to evening, until the evening. He that sits on anything wherein he sat hath the issue, shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and shall be unclean to evening. Now I just want to ask you a question here. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty of life. We have the pictures of Christ, and he's got this little halo, and he's always got this mournful, solemn, real humble look, and the like. I want to tell you something, that when Jesus Christ was a teenager, Joseph died. He had brothers and sisters, and he was the oldest in the house, and he had to raise these brothers and sisters. And I ask you the question, do you suppose that his brothers and sisters ever got boils and ever got defilement on their flesh? Do you suppose that he had to tend to the wounds and clean up the beds? I submit to you that he did. And he touched these things that made him defiled. Now, was that a sin? No, that's life. But if he would have entered the temple with this defilement, apart from washing it, he would have sinned. So he had to wash it off. But that's why Jesus said, thus it becomes us to fulfill all righteousness. What righteousness? You have to be cleansed to clothes and flesh before you can approach God. And the kingdom is coming. So therefore, he said to John, you got to baptize me because I've got to be cleansed from these issues. Now, let's read on. He that touches the flesh of him that has an issue shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. If he that hath an issue spit upon him that is clean, he'll wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. The saddle whatsoever he rideth on that has an issue is unclean. Whosoever toucheth anything that's under him shall be unclean. He that beareth any of these things shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. Whosoever touches that hath the issue and has not rinsed his hands in water, he shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. Here's a kid that's got a pimple and he just popped it, excuse the phrase. Don't mean to be gross. But little Jewish boys and girls had those things, and here is Big Brother. And so he does that, and Jesus Christ says, come on, and he touches him. What happened to Christ? He got unclean. That made him unclean. That didn't make him a sinner, but it made him unclean. It would have made him a sinner had he gone to approach God. When he, verse 13. Let's go to verse number 12. I like this. The vessel of earth that he touches with has the issue shall be broken. Every vessel of wood, if it was hard wood, in other words, shall be rinsed in water. That's why they had constant baptisms. Everything had to be washed all the time. Cleaner than some of the gals in the church, and not as clean as others, but I'm just kidding. Like housework, I am joking. When he that hath an issue is cleansed of his issue, then he shall number himself 7 days for his cleansing. Wash his clothes, bathe himself. In running water shall he be clean. Water where the defilement comes back on and touches your flesh when you get up out of the tub does not qualify. It has to be water that washes the defilement away. Then he comes and makes atonement. Okay, now let's get down to some more nitty-gritty here. Verse number 16. If any man's seed of copulation go out from him, then he'll wash his flesh in water and be unclean. Every garment, every skin where a seed of his copulation shall be washed in water. He is unclean to evening. A woman also with whom a man lie, the seed of copulation, they both shall bathe themselves in water and be unclean. Now, again, let me talk to you about life. Let me talk to you about teenage boys coming into puberty. Teenage boys coming into puberty have times biologically, they cannot help it, it's just nature, where the seed of their copulation comes out of them. And Jesus Christ is older brother. What does he do? I mean, does he just say, ew, you're defiled, I'm not going to touch you? He does not. He gets down and gives the kid a bath, and he takes and changes the sheets and the garments. And then what does he have to do himself? Be baptized. Wash his flesh and wash his clothes. I believe that Jesus was constantly being washed so that he would not be defiled. If a woman have an issue, and her issue in her flesh be blood, this of course is the menstruation time, she shall be put apart 7 days, and whosoever toucheth her shall be unclean until the evening. And everything, note this, everything that she lies on in her separation shall be unclean. Everything that she sits upon shall be unclean. Whosoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. And again, Jesus had sisters. And Mary, of course, was the mom. But the point that we're going to see here is that it was impossible for Jesus Christ to stay in a house with women who were obviously biologically fertile. Their time of the month came, and he had to live with that he would not be unclean in the very house in which he lived. Now note, everything that she touches is unclean. Whosoever touches her bed, washes clothes, bathe himself in water, shall be unclean. Whosoever touches anything that she sat upon, washes clothes, and bathe himself in water, shall be unclean. If it be her bed, anything on which she sits, when he touches it, shall be unclean until the evening. Now, mind you, here are these the little girls. They've got to sit there in the house, especially when it's the first time this happened. They don't know what's happening to them. It's a scary experience. What is happening to me? And yet, now you've got a house that has just been defiled because here's this little girl, her bed, she sits and eats breakfast, and so forth. The whole house is defiled. Do you mean that Jesus jumped up and said, whoa, I just cannot touch anything? He did not. I submit to you that he helped clean the mess. Whatever the situation, he was in there and he got his hands, excuse the phrase, dirty to help Mary and help raise these kids. Now, let's go on. If a man lie with her at all, and her flowers be upon him. I love the King James. Her flowers, my gracious. It's talking about menstrual flow, is what it is. Be upon him. You see, the King James were real prudes, and they were afraid to touch some of these issues for fear they'd be unclean themselves. But that's what it is. It's just the monthly time. She'll be unclean 7 days. The bed is unclean. If a woman have an issue of blood many days, beyond the time of her separation, all the days of her issue of her uncleanness shall be as the days of her separation. She shall be unclean as long as this happens. And if there are complications with this monthly cycle, as long as this happens, she's still unclean. And you know what? If anybody approaches her or touches what she has touched, they become unclean. Now, let's just take a detour here for a second and go back to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5 and verse number 21. Jesus passed over again by ship. Well, I'm getting so rambunctious here in presenting these things. The reason is, it is the basis for John's baptism, and the fact that Jesus Christ was cleansed from sins. What kind of sins? Outward defilement, is touching that which is unclean. Now, it didn't make him a sinner unless he went in the temple, and we'll see that in a minute. We'll hurry here. Went on the other side. He was going to, verse 22, go to the daughter of Jairus. But he said, my little daughter's at the point of death. Lay your hands and she'll be healed. So Jesus went, verse 24, the people followed him and thronged him, and a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years. 12 years, menstrual issue. And remember, if she went beyond her monthly time, it still made her unclean. For 12 years she was unclean. 12 years she couldn't go to church. 12 years she defiled a whole lot of people just by being her. Now, she had suffered many things of the physician, spent all that she had, but nothing better, rather grew worse. She heard of Jesus, came to the press, and touched his garment, for she said, if I can just touch his clothes, I shall be whole. Now, let me ask you something here. If she touched him, what would happen to Christ? Be unclean. Okay, that's part of John's baptism, because he undoubtedly touched people like this or others. But here's the situation here. Straightway or immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed. Jesus, knowing immediately that virtue had gone out of him, said, who touched my clothes? And then finally it said, verse 34, daughter, your faith made thee whole. So I don't know exactly if this defiled him in the sense that when she touched him, everything was cured. but still she had this flow of blood. And Jesus Christ needed to take care of that bodily for himself. Okay, let's come on back. And so, verse number 26, every bed where she lies all the days of her issue shall be under her as the bed of her separation. Whatsoever she sits upon is unclean, as the uncleanness of her separation. Whosoever touches those things shall be unclean. He shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean till the evening. This is why Jesus Christ said to John, it becomes us to fulfill all righteousness. I'm unclean. Can you imagine the Son of God unclean? Yes, he was. Apart from the cross, yes. Would that make him a sinner? No. But did it mean he had to follow the purification rites under the law? Yes, he did. And there were constant washings by Christ. And that's what he was doing there with John the Baptist, fulfilling righteousness. He would have been unrighteous to go into the temple having this defilement on him. It's just part of life. His brothers and sisters didn't mean anything. These people didn't mean to purposefully defile him, and yet he became defiled. If she be cleansed of her issue, then she'll number to herself 7 days. After that, she'll be clean. Now, note verse 31. Thus she shall separate or sanctify the children of Israel. Baptism was an act of ceremonial sanctification, that they die not in their uncleanness. Now, this is the crux of the whole matter. When they defile my tabernacle that is among them, they come to the temple or the tabernacle with defilement on them. Now, let's talk about the defilement here. Number one, the infection in the flesh, part of the curse. Therefore, God could not have that inside of his tabernacle or temple. The seed of copulation. This is how death is transferred. This is how the original sin and the old sin nature is transferred. So they had seed of copulation on them. It would defile everything, and so they were not allowed in the tabernacle and the temple. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that, and again, I'm speaking here like a Dutch uncle, but this is one of the reasons why. Remember, the Apostle Peter said, I'm not allowed to come into a Gentile who's uncircumcised. Why? Because you remember, they didn't take a bath, every spring or so. They didn't take a bath like we do every day. And so therefore, especially an uncircumcised Gentile, if he had relations with a wife and the seed of his copulation was in him and kept in the foreskin, everything he touched would have been defiled. And if Peter came into the house of Cornelius and touched anything, guess what would have happened to the Apostle Peter? Defiled. That's why I said not a lot, but God has shown me the program's changing. But up until that point, it's defilement. And you can't approach the temple in this state. That they die not in their uncleanness. So we've got the infection in the body as a result of the curse. We've got the seed of copulation that transfers the curse. The sin nature. We've got the flowers of the female. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. Again, part of the curse. As a matter of fact, let's look at chapter 18 in Leviticus in verse number 19. Leviticus 18:19. Thou shalt not approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she is put apart for his uncleanness. There is no such thing as having sex during this cycle. Chapter 20 and verse number 18. If a man shall lie with a woman having her sickness, shall uncover her nakedness, he has discovered her fountain, and she has uncovered the fountain of her blood, both of them shall be cut off from among their people. It was a no-no. She was to stay separate for 7 days during that time. And then again, coming back in to go through the process of purification or baptism. So, verse 32 in chapter 15. This is the law of him that has an issue, and of him whose seed goes out and is defiled therewith. By the way, though Jesus Christ never had carnal relations with a woman, you have to understand he was a man, he was a boy, he did grow up, and he did have the biological functions happen to him as well, which would have defiled him. Now, he did not lust, he did not sin. It's just a biology 101. It happens. And of her that is sick of her flowers, and I'm sure that's I say that tongue in cheek, that about every 28 days that you're tired of gardening. You're sick of the flowers. And of him that has an issue, and of man and of woman, and him that lies with her that is unclean. And again, in modern days, if a wife has her monthly time, a husband, there's no difference, sleeps right beside, okay? But in this time, he did not. She was put outside of the camp for 7 days, and she could not come back in, and if he had relations with her, both of them would have been put to death. So we have absolutely no conception of how they lived back then. People who claim, all the Bible applies to me. Okay, great. Start applying chapter 11 and chapter 15. As a matter of fact, the last part, I want you to enter church defiled. They die not in their uncleanness. If these things, happen. Chapter 17. All right? Verse 15. Every soul that eats that which died of itself, that which was torn with beasts, whether it's one of your own country or stranger, he shall both, and this gives us what John the Baptist was doing, wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. Then shall he be clean. But if he wash them not, okay, here's the downside. We were just told in chapter 15, if you go into the tabernacle or temple with this defilement, you did not wash, you are guilty of in effect, defiling it with the infection, with the seed of copulation, with the menstrual blood. You are guilty of defiling it. What does God do? He kills you because you're not allowed to do that. You have to be clean before you enter. If he wash them not, thus it becomes us to fulfill all righteousness. If he wash them not, nor bathe his flesh, note what this verse says. Then he shall bear his iniquity. Jesus Christ had iniquity on him, but he went and washed it. Here was iniquity that was not cleansed by the blood. Here was iniquity that was cleansed by the what? Water. The washing in the water cleansed the iniquity because it took it away. And so if it was in the clothes, it washed it away. If it was on the flesh, it washed it away. Come up out of the water, and they were clean, and they could proceed into the temple undefiled and serve the Lord. Now, that's why, if we'll come to Acts chapter 22. Acts chapter 22. And we'll start reading with verse number 10. Now, we're not going to discuss Paul yet, but I want you to understand why Paul was baptized, why he submitted to the baptism of a kingdom believer. If a kingdom believer wanted to go into the temple, he had to be what? Clean. But if he touched one who was unclean, what did that do to him? Made him defiled. Therefore, the kingdom believer had to always be on guard that he himself was clean so as not to walk into and get a bolt of lightning, walk into the temple and die. Therefore, here is Saul of Tarsus, who has absolutely not only touched dead bodies, he's caused the murder of people. He's orphaned a lot of people. He's tortured a lot of people. Blood indeed was on his hands. If any man was defiled, it was Saul of Tarsus. And so if the kingdom believer is going to have anything to do with him, he had to do what? Cleanse himself. Even though he was a grace believer saved apart from water baptism whatsoever, you have to understand he is beginning to emerge from that system. And he has a temporary ministry to the Jews. So if he's going to walk amongst their midst and not defile them, what does he have to do? Excuse the phrase, take a bath, be baptized. What shall I do, Lord? Verse 10. Lord said, arise, go to Damascus, to be told thee all things which are appointed for thee to do. So they helped me. He was blind into Damascus. And Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of the Jews, said, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. Come down to verse number 16. Why do you tarry? Arise and be baptized. Was Paul baptized? Yes. But the question is, what sins were washed away when it says, well, your sins are washed away calling on the name of the Lord? Israel had two categories of sins. Those which were washed away by the blood, inward things, and those which were washed away by the water. Paul was saved 3 days prior on the road to Damascus by seeing Christ according to mystery and believing on him, where the grace of God was exceeding abundant. But on the other hand, his first contact in Damascus was going to be with kingdom Jews. What did he have to do to have fellowship with them? Be baptized. And that indeed is why the Apostle Paul was dunked. And his sins were washed away. What sins? The same sins or iniquity that was on the person of Christ when he submitted to the water baptism of John. They are not sins in the sense that it made him a sinner. No. He was wholly harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners. But there's the key. He separated himself from sinners in that he did what? Baptized with water, cleansed his flesh, cleansed his clothes, and he approached God in that sanctified state of outer cleanness. All right. Well, we have covered quite a bit of territory. Questions? No question. Yes. Yeah, they had to, it gave them a 24-hour period that they had to wait before the cleanliness was brought into effect. It was just a waiting time. And it's just like the women had to wait 7 days. Yeah, some of them, not all of them, but some of them had to wait 24 hours before the new cleanness took hold. And another thing, you remember Christ and his foot washing. He said, if I've washed you, you don't need to be washed again, as such. But on the other hand, you have to wash your feet. Why? Because in traipsing from the Jordan River to the temple, what gets dirty? Your feet. So you still have to be cleansed because those roads had herds on them, and herds cause defilement, and you have stepped in the dew, and before you can go in that temple, you need feet washing. And that took care of that.